Welcome, everyone. I'm Bonnie Marmer. I'm co-president of the Point San Pedro Road Coalition, and on behalf of our board of directors and the Wetlands Committee of the coalition, I'd like to greet you all, and I'm so glad that you could join us for our meeting on the sea level rise and flooding issues that we face here on the Point San Pedro Road Peninsula. This is an issue important to so many of us, and we're having a great turnout. We have close to 90 people signed up. So I'm very excited that we have some excellent speakers, and we'll learn a lot about this issue. Before we start, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the coalition. I think that there are probably folks here that have not been to prior coalition meetings, but our Point San Pedro Road Coalition is a nonprofit. We've been having meetings for over 20 years, and our mission is to really educate and inform the residents of our area, to work with homeowners associations on important issues such as disaster preparedness and our roadway issues, our wetlands issues, and really to help our community come together to improve and protect the things that are so important and beloved by all of us who live here. And the wetlands are among those wonderful assets that our community enjoys. And as we have been staying home during the shelter in place, and while we've been not going to work and not using our usual time away from home, and instead really wandering around and walking in our neighborhoods, we've found that so many people have asked questions about the bird life and really been interested in our wetlands. So our Wetlands Committee has been coming together to plan some events. I wanted to let you know that our Wetlands Committee is coming up with more plans, and our new Wetlands Committee Chair will tell you a little bit about that. In the meantime, I want to tell everyone that we are recording this event. If there's any reason why you do not want to be on the recording, should your picture show up, you can go ahead and turn off your video if that's important to you. While I am talking to you, I also would like to mention, if you have not been to the Point San Pedro Road Coalition website, sprcoalition.org, I invite you to go there. There is a great deal of information. We must thank Alan Shavitz, our webmaster, for maintaining a fabulous website with information about anything that you want to know about our neighborhoods. And so you can go there and peruse that. You can also sign up to be on our email list if you're not already on our list. At this time, I'd like to turn this over to Alan Shavitz for just a couple of minutes to talk about technical issues of how this meeting is going to go forward. And the next step is for Alan to talk to you. I just got a text from somebody saying they didn't receive the link. So I wonder, as people are signing up here, if other people might be having problems with how to find the link that may have signed up. So that distracted me for a moment here. I apologize for that. Ellen, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, we'll just deal very briefly with technical issues. Obviously, if you can hear me, you've already got the link and you're on. So those who don't have the link, I'm not sure what to do with that. They got the emails and they must have misplaced it. I am meticulously turning off the video on everybody but those that are speaking. And you're all coming on muted. So you should be muted as well. Basically, you're acting as an audience. However, if you want to ask a question or otherwise make a statement, the only way you can do it on a meeting is using the chat function. Now you can either in chat type in a question or a statement, and Bonnie will be reviewing those and will at the appropriate times enunciate them for Jeff to answer or whatever. If it's something that's long or a little more complicated and you want to actually ask your question, then in the chat function, just type something like unmute me, and we'll notice that, and then I can unmute you or give you the opportunity to unmute. So that's the basic process. Again, in the chat function, if you're having any technical problems or whatever, type it in there and I'll try to keep an eye on those. So back to you, Bonnie.
Great, thank you, Alan. One thing I did want to mention is that back, in what, 2008, Alan? I'm not sure. When we were working on the Loch Lomond Marina issues, we were reviewing the EIR for the development that's now the Strand. A number of us got very involved with looking at the flooding there and how that might be affected by sea level rise issues. So some of us were very interested in that issue way back when and presented information to the city about sea level rise. We were a little ahead of our time, and times have changed. I think things are really much more urgent for people to think about the future. Back then, I think that a lot of people thought it was too speculative to work on some of those issues back when we were planning and trying to look forward to how that new development would go forward. Times have changed, and Jeff Rhoads is a great person to talk about that. And we're going to be hearing from him soon. He's going to talk all about that sea level rise and the flooding issues. But before he starts, I want to introduce our new Wetland Committee Chair for a brief statement on what's up with our committee. Winifred DeJohnny.
Hi, hello everybody. I'm Winifred DeJohnny. I'm the chair of the Wetlands Committee of the Point San Pedro Coalition. And I want to thank everybody again for attending this very timely presentation about sea rise in our community. This is the second presentation that's been organized by our committee this year, and the previous one was about the Bose Swifts at the McNear's Brickyard. So if you didn't have a chance to see that version live, it's now recorded, and you can access that on the website, on the SPR Coalition website. You might even still be able to go out to the Brickyard yourself, coming down into the chimneys at dusk. Just bring along a pair of binoculars, but it really is a spectacular sight to see. I was just out there the other night. And then we have a third presentation coming up to close off the year, sometime early in December, and that will be about shorebirds. And that will also be presented by Rich Cimino, who did the wonderful presentation on the Bose Swift, I'm sorry. So 2020 was a year of reinvigorating the Wetlands Committee. And our focus is on education, conservation, and advocacy for these very important, sensitive areas that interweave our community. And I personally became involved because I'm out walking every day amongst these areas, and I really feel like I've been privileged to see the rich network of seasonal life that just surrounds us. And I see something new regularly out there, and it's very exciting to me. And this really made me want to participate in safeguarding and raising awareness about these wonderful habitats that we have adjacent to us. So aside from the presentations, we've also updated our website page on the wetlands. We added a section about local birds, which I encourage you all to go check out. And we're working on interpretive signage for the new Bayside Park and when it's renovated. And we're also planning conservation initiatives around the quarry wetlands and the Loch Lomond marina wetlands in the future. So if you love our wetlands and you want to devote some of your time to meaningful work that will really positively impact them, we strongly encourage you to join us. And we'll be holding our end of the year meeting and strategy session in the third week of November. So if you're interested, go to the sprcoalition.org/wetlands page, and there's a tab there that you can click for contact and just reach out to us, and we would love to have you as part of our engagement and efforts. And now I'll turn it back to Bonnie to begin this really interesting presentation that Jeffrey Rhoads is going to be giving us about sea rise in our community.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Winifred.
Mhm.
Right. So Jeff Rhoads, he's Executive Director of Resiliant Shore, a San Rafael-based nonprofit, which is focused on flood risk reduction and sea level rise adaptation for San Rafael and the North Bay. He received a BA in architecture from my alma mater, UC Berkeley, a master's of architecture from MIT, and is a California licensed architect. His professional experience includes program management, landscape scale planning, and design of human and natural environments, and securing project entitlements. He is also a neighbor. He is a San Rafael General Plan 2040 steering committee member, which is where I got to know him. We served together on that steering committee. And he also served on the Mayor's Committee on Good Design Downtown. He's a San Rafael Heritage Board member and a member of Sustainable San Rafael. I believe we're also going to hear from Stuart Siegel. Before I turn it over to you, Jeff, is Stuart here?
Yes, he is. I'm setting him up to get his voice going.
Okay, good. So I might as well just tell you about Stuart, because Stuart is going to be joining us, and we're delighted that he can join us as well. Stuart has spoken a couple of times at our annual community meeting in the past. We've invited him as a guest speaker. We also engaged him to help us when we had a wetlands project a number of years ago, where we raised money and got a county grant to do a flap gate for the wetland at Beach Drive. He's an expert that we admire and really appreciate locally. He's the Coastal Resilience Specialist at the San Francisco Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, and a research professor at San Francisco State University in the Department of Earth and Climate Sciences, both based at the university's Estuary and Ocean Science Center in Tiburon. Dr. Siegel has long been involved in wetlands restoration and regional ecosystems restoration, planning, and science, and for many years has focused on climate change resiliency for our natural systems and the built environment. He's actively involved in nature-based solutions for adapting to sea level rise and other climate change impacts. And we have more recently been working with him. Our committee, our board member, Katie Miller, has been active on a project with Dr. Siegel and a number of other stakeholders with regard to the roadway through China Camp. I don't know whether he will touch on that, but that is yet another project that is important for our community, both because of the importance of the wetlands out there and because the roadway provides egress in an emergency, but it is frequently flooded, especially in high tides. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Jeff Rhoads. Thank you very much, Jeff, for being here. And we really have been looking forward to this presentation.
It's all yours.
Jeff, please mute yourself. I will mute myself right now. Thank you.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you all for inviting us to join you. I'd like to thank Bonnie and Alan and Winifred and the board of the San Pedro Road Coalition. I am also a member. And I'd also like to thank our core team members, Stuart, Kathy Schaefer, and Janine Pfeiffer. I'm not certain if Kathy will join us. She was planning on joining us. Kathy is a PhD candidate at Davis, and her focus has been on risk reduction, flood insurance. She was most recently with FEMA and was responsible for updating the flood insurance rate map, which was updated in 2016 for Marin County. And Janine is a PhD ethnobiologist, and her focus on our team is really related to community engagement. So let me get started with a PowerPoint presentation here. Let's see, here we go. And I'll share my screen and start the presentation. And let's get going. Okay, I hope you all can see the screen. Let me know if there's a problem. Let's start off first with the focus of the presentation this evening is really to drill down on the impacts of sea level rise along Point San Pedro Road and getting ourselves prepared for a citizen response to initiate adaptation planning. And let's talk a little bit about what the primary objectives are for this evening. The first of which is to share with folks what the risks are, so you have an understanding of what the risks are today and where they will be as seas begin to rise. The other thing that I want to do is share with you what's been going on in terms of planning, both locally in San Rafael as well as regionally, and share with you the notion that a lot has been done in terms of identifying the risks and identifying the assets at risk, and the work is just beginning really on looking at adaptation strategies. The next thing is to talk about what is it we can do to move forward on adaptation planning and understand the urgency of moving forward and what is holding our city back. Share with you what we can do together and ultimately gain your support and commitment for action. I thought the two images on the right were a good indication of where we are today. The image on the top is Mooring Road, and this photograph was taken in a king tide last year, and it shows the road underwater just from blue water high tides. And the lower image was taken about 2 weeks ago on Seaway, and it is also indicating flooding at high tide. Has actually made it not possible to walk down the street without getting your feet wet. So let's talk a little bit about what Resilient Shore is. As Bonnie had mentioned, we're a nonprofit project, and the project itself has been around since 2015, but our team members have been involved in wetlands and sea level rise and other related issues for quite some time. I started in 2012. Stuart has been involved for many years in wetlands restoration and that sort of thing. And Kathy was with FEMA for many years and was involved in infrastructure finance for the city of Richmond prior to that. So our focus is really primarily at the moment on San Rafael, because San Rafael is one of the first places affected by sea level rise and already has a rather serious challenge associated with flooding. So let's move on, and just a bit about myself. My experience has been in large scale city building, primarily with master plan communities, new towns. Among the projects that I've worked on are Summerlin in Las Vegas, Nevada, which will have an ultimate build out population of about 200,000, and Valencia in Southern California. I was the director of advanced planning, so I dealt with major infrastructure issues and entitlements for the whole master plan community, as well as design of major infrastructure projects like the regional trail system, the freeway through Summerlin, and parks and trails and all that sort of stuff, and also the town center master plan. And one of the most exciting projects actually was doing the urban design for all the bridges and trail structures in Summerlin, which were based on Native American petroglyphs. Now let's move on.
Hey, Jeff?
Yeah.
We're not, sorry to interrupt, we're not seeing the progression of your slides. We're still frozen on the very first one.
That is weird. Why would that be? Huh. Resume share. How about now?
That worked, thank you.
But it doesn't allow me to advance the slides. Interesting.
Try using the left and right arrows on the bottom corner of your slide and see if that helps.
That's not helping.
No.
That is really weird. So you're not, how about now? Did you see a change?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, that's good. Then I can just click on the screen and it'll change the slide. Okay, let's get oriented first. This is a familiar aerial view for many of you, I'm sure, looking at Google Earth. And what you're looking at is the central San Rafael Valley and the portion of San Rafael that extends out through your neighborhoods along Point San Pedro Road to Point San Pedro and the Dutra Quarry. This area, basically from ridge to ridge, is called the San Rafael Operational Landscape Unit. That's a mouthful, isn't it? But what that is that's a designation by ABAG for a planning area. And it's very important because as various different municipalities and counties and so forth go forward with planning for adaptation, the region is going to expect them to look at these operational landscape units. And that's really kind of an interesting thing because they vary considerably. Generally, they relate to watersheds. But when you're in a place in the South Bay, in many cases, there isn't really a clear definition between your OLU and somebody else's because there are no topographic features that separate you. Well, here in San Rafael, we probably have the most clearly defined OLU, operational landscape unit of all, because we really are clearly defined by topography. That's a good thing in certain respects, and it's a challenging thing in others. The good aspect is that we have a minimal amount of interface that we have to do with other governmental authorities and jurisdictions adjacent to us. And another challenge, however, is that we're sort of in this alone. The city doesn't have flood control districts set up. It manages flood control simply through the general fund and our public works department. And so we're independent, but we're also somewhat on our own. Now, this OLU, incidentally, will figure more as we move forward. So let's see. Here's a kind of an interesting image from the Adjusting to Rising Tides Bay Shoreline Flood Explorer. And it shows, again, that OLU. And unfortunately, it's missing data from roughly the Marin Yacht Club all the way east to the Dutra Quarry. And I don't know why that is, but for some reason they don't have data. So in order for us to be able to understand present and future flood and sea level rise impacts, we basically have to look at the FEMA maps. But this is kind of an interesting thing and a fun thing to play with. You can Google ART Bay Shoreline Flood Explorer, and once you get onto it and you start playing around with it, you can look at what the projected sea level rise will do in terms of impacts. And you can look at things like what happens when there's a king tide, or what happens when there's a 5-year flood event, or a 20-year flood, or a 25-year flood event. And so it's kind of interesting because it's very useful for telling you what to expect in the future. So let's move on here. Now, this is a kind of a neat exhibit that was prepared by Dr. Siegel. And although it doesn't show what's going on the Point San Pedro Road area, it does show how serious the problem is for the central San Rafael Valley. The areas that are shown in yellow are the areas that would be inundated in a 100-year flood, a flood that supposedly has a 1% chance of occurring in any 1 year. Now, of course, we've seen that can happen twice in 2 years, or even more frequently if things don't go well. But what this exhibit shows is the height of the shoreline protection along the shore, and the areas in red would be overtopped in a 100-year event. And look at what happens all along the canal. It's rather significant. And it shows how serious of a problem we have just with flooding, not even taking into account sea level rise. So now let's turn our focus specifically to Point San Pedro Road, since that is what we're here for tonight. And the next exhibit is going to be of the FEMA flood insurance rate map. Now, we'll talk about the areas extending all the way from 101 out to Peacock Gap and the Dutra Quarry property. Here's the wetlands for the Dutra, adjacent to the Dutra Quarry. This is Peacock Gap. Here's Glenwood. This is Chicken Point, Loch Lomond and its marina. This is Loch Lomond, and here's the high country. I guess San Pedro Cove is right here. And then this is Marin Yacht Club. I'm here on this little hill right here. So let's go on to the next one. And here is the FEMA 2016 flood insurance rate map, which is the most recent. And you can see in the flood insurance rate map, the blue areas are those that are subject to the 1% or 100-year flood. And you can see how it impacts Peacock Gap. And also, of course, the wetlands here next to the quarry. And it also impacts lower lying areas in Loch Lomond and Glenwood, and some areas along Point San Pedro adjacent to the Marin Yacht Club. Okay, that's interesting. Looks like we went on here. Now, this exhibit shows us why those areas are impacted. This is looking back in time to 1915, and what you can see on the exhibit are the topography, San Rafael as it was back in 1915, downtown San Rafael, Gerstle Park, and the Dominican neighborhood, and this is Country Club emerging. But all of these areas that you see in blue have been substantially urbanized. They're basically former bay salt marsh. And what happens when you fill these bay mud areas is, as time goes on, things subsides. The mud actually compresses, and the end result is the areas become more and more subject to flood risk because the soil is consolidating and the areas are actually sinking. And here is Peacock Gap. You can see it right here. And so you see that much of the level areas of Peacock Gap around the lagoon and the golf course are subject to our former baylands and are subject to subsidence, and areas that will be the first to be reclaimed by the bay if we don't come up with some sort of adaptation strategy. And the same, of course, applies to the central San Rafael Valley. And the city now extends all the way out to San Rafael Rock. It's no longer out in the bay. It's actually engaged in the shoreline. So if we do nothing, what will happen is many of our neighborhoods will be subject to more frequent flooding. And as time goes on, if we do nothing, the area will be reclaimed by the bay. Now, there'll be some rather obvious outcomes here, but the most significant is eventually flood insurance will be unattainable. And also, if we don't act quickly, we won't have the help that we need from external sources. And eventually, the onslaught of sea level rise will exceed our capacity to respond. Now, these images that you see on the left are probably familiar to you. There are times when the storm surge is actually breaking over the armored shoreline along Point San Pedro Road between Glenwood and Peacock Gap. So let's kind of talk about what really needs to be done. And the issue here is that in order for any shoreline adaptation work to be done, even if it's simply wetlands restoration projects, there needs to be a cohesive look at the shore to allow individual projects to go forward. In essence, we need to do the planning that enable specific projects to go forward. And what the city has done, and what Bonnie and I participated in with others, was establishing the policy in the general plan that states that the city will proceed with a shore and watershed adaptation plan as part of the action items from the general plan. Thing is, though, is there needs to be money and staff resources in order to do that. So this watershed and adaptation plan would not just focus on the shore, but would also look at the watersheds back of the shore and actually all the way to their headwaters. And the notion is you need to look at these things holistically and deal with flood runoff in a more holistic manner, and also look at things in a more thoughtful way with respect to wetlands restoration, watershed restoration, dealing with wildland fires, and also dealing with sediment transport in these watersheds. So in order to move forward on this master plan, in our vision, we see this as being something that's a community-focused planning effort. And what that means is that all of the various different neighborhoods, stakeholder groups, nonprofit organizations would participate in this plan that would be based upon their needs and their values. And by having everybody participate from the beginning and establishing what needs and values are and establishing an evaluation criteria for various solutions that might come out of the planning process, we would be able to reach consensus more quickly and arrive at a document that really reflects the needs and interests of the community. We need this coalition of neighborhoods, stakeholders, and other participants in order to make the planning process successful. The other reason we need this coalition is the city needs to be motivated to act. And once the master plan is prepared and receives environmental clearance, then it will be possible to initiate the planning and ultimately funding and implementation of adaptation projects. So the issue, though, is that we have a little problem with urgency. For one thing, time isn't on our side. We all know that we're experiencing more extensive events like droughts and flooding, and we know that we can anticipate accelerated sea level rise. It's actually exceeding the mid-marks that were expected. The other thing is doing anything like this is a very complex and long journey. It's one that we need to start straight away if we're going to get to the desired results before we can't do anything about it. The other thing, and I'll share this with you a little further, is that we have momentum now, and I'll explain a little more why that is. And we need to have projects planned and designed in order to get money to get them implemented. So you have to start out with planning, design projects ultimately, and then be in a position to receive funding to implement those projects. But I must share with you that it's not just going to be something that someone else is going to have to pay for. We will need to have skin in the game. The other aspect of this is that since all communities along the shoreline nationwide are going to be impacted by sea level rise, we're going to find that competition for funds is going to increase dramatically. And so the first folks in are going to be the ones with the greatest opportunity to receive external help. So let's talk a little bit about what our obstacles are. And the first one is that this pandemic has really had a dramatic impact on San Rafael's budget and staffing. And the city is really focusing on responding to this crisis. So their energies are right now focused on just these really serious issues associated with the pandemic and the substantial reduction in revenue that's resulting from a reduction in business activity. So, and they have now about 12 positions that are unfilled in the planning and the community development department, which means they don't have the staff capacity to take on an initiative like this. The other aspect is that folks by nature who are involved in municipal governance are risk adverse and don't really have the motivation to take this on for the previous reason. The fact is there just aren't resources and they're focusing on other things. So ultimately, the citizens in our community, in the form of a coalition, need to tell the council that this is really a priority and that we need to start on this straight away. And folks like us are ready to help the city raise funds through private donations and through grants, and also provide staff to augment city staff to move forward with this shore and watershed adaptation plan. So obviously we need to find the money, help the city find the money and put together the right team. And we need to get people on board to participate in this community-driven planning process, not only to prepare the plan, but ultimately to advocate for implementation of those things that they really care about. Now, the good news is there's been a tremendous amount of work already done at a regional level and a local level. Regionally, we have things like the Adapting to Rising Tides Atlas, which came out in March, and it produced this document that describes these OLUs and potential adaptation strategies. We also have a draft general plan update, which is now available for public review, and that Bonnie and I were involved in, as well as other representatives from various different interests in the community. And it very clearly identifies policy and actions related to this issue of sea level rise and flooding. Another interesting thing that's happened is the city has declared the Southeast San Rafael Canal neighborhood area a PDA. Now, we out on Point San Pedro Road may think of this as not affecting us directly, but actually it does, to the extent that it provides planning dollars and motivation to not only deal with the area that is around the canal and in Southeast San Rafael, but also this general adaptation planning that addresses all of us. The other thing is, by and large, as a result of things like the Resilient by Design Challenge, which San Rafael participated in and was one of the communities that was studied, and all of the work by the county with the Bay Wave study by Chris Chu and the white paper that was prepared by Paul Jensen, we all have a fairly good idea of what's at risk, and we're in a position where we're ready to act. So since we know about the problem, let's address it. The other thing is that the region, through things like the Adapting to Rising Tides Atlas, recognize that we're amongst the first places affected by as little as 12 inches of sea level rise. We also have critical regional infrastructure, and we also have a disadvantaged community. All of these things put us at the top of the list right now for external help, along with the PDA designation for Southeast San Rafael. So this equals momentum, and it's something that we should take advantage of right now before we lose that momentum. And of course, we at Resilient Shore are here to help. We're ready to help the city raise money, and we have expertise and local knowledge that can really help get this project going. So what our objectives are to assemble a coalition of folks, primarily leaders in the community, opinion makers, and get people ready for a shore and watershed adaptation master plan. We're also here to help the city, but we need the coalition to motivate the city council to move forward on this. So far, folks have been focused on re-election and other issues, but this is one of those things that's really important and won't go away. And the other thing is, we want to help, when the plan is done, communities and stakeholders implement adaptation projects, help them, advise them, help them set up appropriate governance, that sort of thing. So that kind of gets us to where we are, and that is, our ask for you is to consider joining a stakeholder coalition with others. We have a draft charter that we'll supply for input and modification as required. We want you to help us by informing the City Council of the urgency of moving forward with a shore watershed adaptation master plan. And we think the best time to do that will be after the City Council is seated and in the first quarter of 2021, when they have an opportunity to get down to business. And finally, we really need to have you participate in the adaptation plan and its implementation, primarily to advocate for your needs and values and make sure that the plan reflects things that you care about. So a couple of things before we open up to questions. If you wish to be in, Resilient Shore publishes periodic email newsletters called the Shore News. And we also are in a position to be able to inform people about things of interest related to this subject. So if you want to receive that stuff, please put your name and email address in the chat box, and we will add you to our email distribution list. And with that, I would like to open things up to Bonnie and see if folks have questions or comments. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. Have we left share screen?
Yes, you have.
Good.
For those who want to ask questions, two choices. One is type your question in the chat screen, using the chat icon, and we'll deal with those. If what you want to do is a little bit more elaborate and it's difficult to type, type in the chat screen, unmute me. What we'll do there, I mean, you can unmute yourself, but the problem is if everyone unmutes themselves, we'll have a cacophony. So I'd like to ask you to simply say, please unmute me like Bonnie just did. And I will then give each person permission to speak. So Bonnie, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Looks like you're still muted, Bonnie. Oh, she's trying. Let's see. Well, I see some questions here. First from Maggie Phillips. Does how much a person pays for flood insurance reflect the level of potential risk of flooding? And the answer is, Kathy actually is probably the best equipped to answer this, and I believe she's on. Kathy, would you like to respond? We're not getting her to respond. I'll take a shot at this. The answer is generally yes. The greater the risk, the higher the insurance rate, or the insurance premium, and it can come to a point where if there's repeated losses, the insurance may not be provided. Is this you, Kathy?
Hi, this is Kathy. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Wonderful.
Oh, great. So, like all things related to FEMA, the answer really is it depends. So, to some degree, yes, you do pay a different rate. If you are in an A zone as opposed to an X zone, you will pay a higher rate. And that A zone reflects the fact that you are in a 100-year or greater flood risk area. But one of the issues with FEMA is that it's a 50-year-old program, and the way that they assess the rates and figure out how much any one particular person should pay is based on an algorithm developed 50 years ago before we had computers. And then you add to the fact that the rates are set by Congress. Congress approves the rates and sets them. So sometimes people pay less than the actuarial rate, the true rate, and sometimes they pay more. So That's a very long answer to say it depends. But by and large, if you are in an A zone, then you will pay more than the person whose home or structure is in an X rated zone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to Jeff. This is Bonnie. I don't know if Alan can start my video again while I speak. I'm not sure, but I wanted to thank Jeff for that excellent presentation, and thank everyone who is submitting questions and comments, including Stuart Siegel. I wanted to suggest maybe Stuart could make a few more comments and talk a little bit about the grand jury report he mentioned in his comments, and anything else that he thought would be appropriate to bring up at this juncture.
Sure. Thanks so much, Bonnie. And thanks a lot, Jeff, for that wonderful background and context you provided. Really critical. And I just really want to emphasize Jeff's call for getting the city council to really prioritize handling this issue, because in the end, doing projects that protect us from flooding from either sea level rise or storms, even groundwater, they happen essentially by local governments. And so they need to be taking the initiative to start planning and moving forward with these efforts. So that's a really critical component here. And so my video is now on, so I'm sitting here talking. A couple of things. So one, Jeff mentioned sort of the watershed based approach, like the operational landscape units. And one of the things that we really see in Marin and very much in San Rafael is that they don't always make the most sense for us, because while from a flood protection standpoint, making sure that we protect the entirety of downtown San Rafael, if you leave low spots, you still get flooding. The other side of that coin is the transportation network. And Marin County is kind of unique in this regard because we're hills and valleys. And so, for example, the roads, Point San Pedro Road that goes around to China Camp but becomes North San Pedro Road, it's a pretty important transportation corridor, and it crosses watersheds. And so there's this huge push on this whole watershed approach, but it really unfortunately misses the human use of the environment, which is transportation, getting places. And so the work we've been doing at China Camp, for example, is trying to really emphasize the role of the transportation networks and how humans use them in these kind of planning efforts. The Marin County Grand Jury spent about a year doing an assessment of where all the cities and the county is at with addressing climate change and sea level rise in particular, and released a report maybe a month ago or so, maybe a little bit more than that. And it was pretty dramatic in its findings, which are that there is not enough going on. There's a complete lack of coordination between each of the cities and the county, that there's no real dedicated staff anywhere. So like at Marin County, there are some very dedicated individuals in various departments doing things, but there's no countywide coordination and there's no program to really support them. And they all do this as part of their other jobs. In the case of San Rafael, the planning does part of the climate change work, and Public Works does some of it, but there's no comprehensive climate change strategy within the city of San Rafael. And that's pretty similar through the rest of Marin County's jurisdictions. And so the grand jury report calls for creation of a countywide intergovernmental task force to do things in a very coordinated fashion and to really tackle these issues across jurisdictions. And so, and I think and Point San Pedro Road is a fantastic example that you all are probably very familiar with, the very jagged lines between city and county jurisdictions. You drive out Point San Pedro Road, and and so if it's only the city or the county doing things, that leaves gaps everywhere, and it makes no sense because it's the same road with the same flood risk throughout the whole area. And I think many of you who live out there, might have encountered this. You get a permit from the city or a permit from the county to rebuild your garage or whatever you needed to do, and it's something we all face. So another point that Jeff made, which I think is really critical, is in March, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission released its regional Adapting to Rising Tides report. And it had one very significant conclusion in there, which is with just a small amount of sea level rise, about 12 inches, that San Rafael is one of 3 places in the entire Bay Area that was pretty badly impacted. And the second is Mill Valley, the Manzanita area, the park and ride we're all pretty familiar with. And the third one is off in eastern Contra Costa County. And so it doesn't take much for San Rafael to take a hit. And once you go above that 1 foot of sea level rise, then the rest of the Bay Area starts really experiencing problems. And so Jeff also mentioned the notion of getting in line early for money, because there will be more and more competition to raise money to solve these problems. And the longer San Rafael waits, the less likely it is to get money. And we're suffering with everybody else. And tied with that as a good example is that Caltrans had put out to bid rebuilding of the 101 off-ramp to Central San Rafael, the northbound off-ramp. And they didn't go forward because the bids were several $1 million over their engineers' estimates. That $20 million project was to rebuild that off-ramp at grade. And if any of you paid attention on big tides, the road surface is about 9 inches above the water in the channel right there on big tides and during storms. And so spending $20 million to rebuild with nicer pavement and 1 or 2 lanes wider, but no improvement to flood risk, that I call that a stranded asset. The $20 million is a lot of money to spend for something that has a 20-year lifespan at best, and then has to get redone. And this is where the city comes in, is to get them to work with Caltrans to redesign that, because it does need to be fixed. I think we all can agree that that's a good area, needs to be fixed, but it's spending $20 million to fix it really nicely for a 15, 20-year lifespan. Does that make sense? So just kind of point out some of those kinds of things that are really important for us in San Rafael. And, our individual vulnerability ties to the region because of the transportation corridors. And, my house is about 70-foot elevation, but the bottom of my road is at 5. And if I want to go to the grocery store or drink water or flush my toilet, go to the doctor, all those things that we all want to do, sea level rise affects me and all the rest of us equally. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Stuart. That was a great summary of a panoply of issues that we are all facing. Certainly, our focus has been over the years to try and coordinate between city and county, because indeed, this roadway goes through the city, then the county, then the city, then the county, and a number of us I'm in the county, I'm in unincorporated county, and so many of us are in the city limits. So we often try to bring the city and the county together at our annual meeting, just to help get the officials in the same room. And for years we've had the mayor and our representative on the board of supervisors. And I just wanted to mention that on November 14th, we're going to do that again, but this time by Zoom. We're having our annual community meeting, and we're going to have our newly elected mayor, whoever that is. Both of the candidates have agreed to come to our Zoom meeting. We'll have Damon Connolly, for our representative on the board of supervisors, and we'll have our new fire chief there. And as Jeff pointed out, fire issues are important to the sea level rise issues too. It all kind of comes together. Flooding issues, all these disaster issues that we have to deal with out here. So I wanted to just give a plug to marking the calendars for November 14th at 10 a.m. for that meeting that's coming up. I also wanted to mention and ask a question. I have asked Jeff this, but I want to ask you as well, if I can. I have heard that one strategy for dealing with flooding along Point San Pedro Road might be to have pocket beaches. For example, on that stretch between the Brickyard Beach and the area that's at the Bayside Park. And I'm wondering whether you might have a comment on creating that kind of thing, and how that would fit into kind of a bigger strategy for our area.
Sure. So I have been part of design teams and built beaches in San Francisco Bay for this exact purpose. And they are remarkably effective. And so if you think about that open stretch you just described, I've been out there many times in the winter and watched storm-driven waves at higher tides splashing against the rocks and up over onto the road and putting a fair bit of water onto Point San Pedro Road there. And a few times I've seen one lane of the road pretty much underwater. And so the idea of beaches is what they do is they absorb the energy of the waves and absorb it further offshore and flatten the water out so that by the time it gets to the shoreline where that rock riprap is now, then the sidewalk and the road, those waves aren't happening anymore. And so that idea of like a storm surge, which is what happens along there, would be pretty significantly dampened if we had a beach along there, for example. And it's a pretty high energy area. And you know, so you have to get the right kind of beach. It's more of a gravel beach than a sandy beach. And if you look at that little pocket beaches there now, it's a pretty coarse sandy beach right now, and that's what nature wants to put there. And so you would kind of follow the lesson of nature, and it's a very effective strategy to really provides habitat, and it really protects infrastructure for quite a bit. And you can design these so that you can feed them over time. So when you have sea level rise, you can go back out and basically do a beach nourishment project like people, you know, they do on the East Coast all the time in Southern California. Even Crown Beach and Alameda gets beach nourishment, and add material in there and maintain that function even with sea level rise. And so it's a very powerful and effective way to provide sea level rise without building a bunch of seawalls and other what people call gray infrastructure.
May I interject here? I'd like to address some of the questions that I see in the chat box. The first of which was from Dolores Heeb about sense of timeline. And the answer really there is we don't know exactly what the timeline is for sea level rise, but we do know we currently have significant risk from flooding. So that alone should be motivation for action. I believe the State Office of Planning has come up with guidance on what the expectations are for sea level rise. But really the issue is looking at elevation. We plan for a certain amount of elevation change in our design, and we will observe what happens over time. The other thing that I notice is that Denise Lucy has asked, what is the county's sense of urgency on the road, on the sections of road within their jurisdiction? I think it's safe to say they are certainly aware, and the grand jury has brought to their attention that more action is required. I must share with you that according to Paul Jensen, the city and county are looking at setting up a joint power authority, a JPA, to address these issues. I'm not sure what the status is on that. I know Paul mentioned it was in the works. With respect to Ron Waters, the presentation that I made to you really doesn't assume any specific rate of sea level rise. What you saw is current flood risk rather than assumptions about sea level rise. But what we do know is that as time goes on, the 100-year flood ponding elevation will go up along with sea level rise. So more and more areas will be affected over time. And if nothing is done, settled areas will be subject to more frequent flooding and ultimately inundation. So let's see, I think I've answered all the questions. Is there anything else?
Let me comment more on the rate of sea level rise. So the California Ocean Protection Council is the agency that's charged with looking at periodic updates to sea level rise projections for the coast of California. And their most recent update was in 2018. And then it looks at a range of scenarios for climate change. There's, you know, more optimistic ones that we succeed in lowering greenhouse gas emissions and do more carbon sequestration, and ones that are more pessimistic where we keep having pretty high emissions. And so the numbers, I just did this the other day, that for 3 feet of sea level rise, which is a number people focus on a lot, in the worst case scenario in the 2018 projections, we'd have 3 feet of sea level rise by 2060. And in the best case, we would be like 2120 or something like that. And so if you back that down to like 1 foot of sea level rise, which is what was reflecting for San Rafael, the worst case was we'd see that in about 10 years from now. And the best case is we'd see that in about 30 years from now or 40 years from now. So, and keep in mind that when you want to start developing solutions and actually building them, the community planning process, the engineering process, the permitting, the fundraising, that 5 years is a hyper fast timeline. 10 to 15 years is that's very common. And so this is why getting started on these complicated processes, and they will be complicated soon, so that we actually can build them in time for when we need them, and not waiting until we start having a problem and then begin a 5 or 10 or 15 year process. And because one thing to keep in mind is that more or less, a lot of the strategies are going to have problems. There's just no way to have this, the old idea of the win-win-win, that everything is just hunky-dory and perfect for everybody. There's some of that out there, but more often there's going to be challenges, whether it's for adverse impacts to the environment or adverse impacts to some version of how humans use the landscape, be it more community-based or more localized, that there's always going to be challenges. And in the end, choices and trade-offs have to be talked about and eventually made. And those are difficult, and those take time to work through, because you really get to the level of this is my house or my community, and I have an interest in it. And so allowing for those processes to occur and people to engage and participate and understand what the solutions might be, even if they don't like them, is really important. And that takes time, and to do it well takes time. And I think that's one of the reasons to really get going fast, so that we can do that in a way that really allows people to have their voices heard and understand what's going on.
Stuart, I think it would be really helpful if you shared with us your experiences with the Spinnaker Lagoon as kind of a good case study for how difficult it is to move forward with a project when you have the opposition of a few folks, particularly when you're not part of a larger master plan for the shoreline.
I'll do a compare and contrast between Spinnaker and China Camp. So we did a China Camp planning process. Katie Miller was one of many people involved, city and county and agencies and various groups, and went through a lot of the problems, a lot of the possible solutions, really allowed people to weigh in on what they wanted to see for the future. And in the end, there was huge support, even though some folks said, well, some of those solutions I don't like, but I can see that those are what our choices are. And I'm willing to accept something, because even if I'm not happy with it, because I see how it helps me as well as hurts me. The contrast to Spinnaker Lagoon was that they had a small number of houses facing the lagoon, major problem with rotting algae, horrific smells. People couldn't use their backyards because the horrific nature of rotting algae smell all summer long. They had to keep their houses closed, the air conditioning on, and their filters changed, and they couldn't use their property. And one of the possible solutions for that was to open the area back up to the tides. And to do that, you have to build a setback levee. And that setback levee would the top of it would be about 4 feet above the backyards of people who live there. Most of the homeowners were very supportive, but 3 were like, over my dead bodies, are you ever going to do that? You're going to ruin my property value and take my view away, and I don't care about anybody else. And they succeeded in stopping 2 rounds of funding to do the engineering work to try to solve that problem out there. And so, and one of them had said, oh, well, when I bought my house just a few years ago, I never read the disclosures, so I have no idea what the issues are here. And because I don't do that, I'm going to impose my will on everybody so that everyone suffers with algae and no one gets sea level rise protection. And so it's a real contrast in people's engagement. But the other side of that is that, yeah, there is a little backyard view impact, right? They don't lose their view to the bay, and there's many ways to mitigate that. And when it comes to dealing with sea level rise, we're going to have to find ways to address the problems that occur. And we don't want to deny them. We don't want to say they're not going to happen, but it's how we come up with a solution that recognizes them and does the best as possible to address them. And so it's a real difference between those 2 efforts.
Thank you for explaining that. That's very interesting to see how one can go so well and one can be problematic. I do have a question for Jeff real quick. He mentioned.
I need to get off actually, so I'm going to say goodbye.
All right. Well, thank you so much
Thank
for
you,
joining
everybody.
us and answering all those questions. We really appreciate all the work that you've done for our community and all around. So thank you for
You're
being
very
with us.
welcome. Yep, and I'm part of the community too. I love it. So
Okay.
thank you very much, everybody.
Right.
Okay,
Okay.
bye-bye.
Bye. So very quickly, Jeff, you mentioned the PDA or Priority Development Area designation for the canal. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that's helpful, why that's helpful, why should we care? And the other question I wish I had been able to ask Stuart, but I don't know if you know or whether he might know, was about the missing data from the OLU. Why is it missing for our area and what can we do about it?
That's a fair question. I think, let me answer that question first. The person who was in charge for the ART Adaptation Atlas lives here in our community. Her name is Dana Breckwald.
Right. Okay.
And Dana, you might ask that question of Dana specifically and see if something can be done about it.
Okay.
All right, and I also wanted to go back a bit and kind of expound on Stuart's comments about Spinnaker. And I think there's a couple of lessons there, one of which is there's always going to be people who object to moving forward with something that is of value to the community. But if there is community consensus around an overall master plan, it's a lot easier for folks to say, well, this is what the community wants. We understand you object personally, but we need to move forward for the benefit of the community. And the other thing about community-driven planning processes is the typical strategy that one sees with public works departments and many planning departments is retain a professional, a consultant team, have the consultant team come up with a series of solutions, identify the preferred solutions, and then try to sell them to the community. That, in our estimation, is really upside down. What you really need to do first is you need to start off with the community and understand what people's needs and values are, and establish an agreed upon set of evaluation criteria, and then start to brainstorm design solutions and evaluate those solutions based upon the agreed upon criteria. So you don't want to start designing too early. What you really want to do is know what the program is. Where is it you want to go? How is it we evaluate these various different alternatives from a standpoint of environmentally, socially, economically, impact on disadvantaged communities, what have you. Once there's that agreed upon criteria and folks are all understanding the nature of the problem, both environmentally, physically, and in all other aspects, and there's an agreement on the facts, then it's a lot easier to reach a consensus on how to move forward. And so that's really why this community-led planning process is so critical and why your all involvement is so critical to its success.
Well, one of the questions Tricia Rose just asked is, how can we be proactive? And I think that this is the first step, right? For us to become educated about what the issues are, who the players are, and as a community to come together and start working with the city, the county, Resilient Shore, regional water board, whoever it is that is going to be looking with all of the issues. We have some very important wetlands here. We want to maintain them. We want to look at all the other adaptations that can help us avoid flooding. We've certainly learned a lot through our work at the coalition, just dealing with the flooding of our roadway and so many issues that have come up over the last 20 plus years. So
well, let me share with you an observation. All of those folks, those regional resource agencies, will ultimately be involved with what we do. But the place we really need to start is with our city council And by forming a coalition of stakeholders that wants to motivate the city to move forward, that is really our first step. We can provide education, we can meet with folks, but at the end of the day, the city council has to direct staff to move forward. And if staff can't find the resources, perhaps they can partner with us and we can help them get donations from major general engineering companies that are going to benefit from all the work that's going to come out of this, from major businesses, from philanthropists. We can also apply for grants, but all that's only possible when the city recognizes us and accepts our willingness to help them. And right now we aren't there with them yet. They haven't done that before, and so they're not enthusiastic about it.
Well, we've been lucky. We've gotten a few grants from the county already, and the coalition is, I think, has been really effective in getting some work done with the city and the county over the past 20 years. And I'm looking forward to energizing folks to work with you and move on from here. So this was very much appreciated that you provided this presentation. This presentation will be available online. It's been recorded. And I want to thank everyone for their participation, for their good questions that they submitted. And most of all, big thanks to Jeff for this presentation. We look forward to seeing everyone again at our next meeting, which is November 14th. And for those who don't know, Denise Lucy, my co-president, has been with us and asked some good questions. Thank you, Denise. And thank you, Ellen, for setting this all up. Thanks to all of you, and good night.